Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great and his armies conquered the Promised Land, conquered the land of Israel in 329 BCE, and established there the continuation of the great empire that reached even beyond the Promised Land, all the way to the northern part of Egypt, and the great city of Alexandria. Alexandria was settled as well around that time. The Greek Empire was an amazing font of knowledge. They brought, wherever they came, they brought their philosophers. They brought their idea of the burgeoning democracy. They brought their theater. They built arenas in which they had sports, games, parties. They were pagan. They had different cults. Sometimes they drank a lot of wine if they worshipped Dionysus. They brought this whole culture with them. And so they understood that if they wanted to stay in power wherever they conquered, they didn't have to put people down. They didn't have to turn the people they had conquered into slavery. They didn't have to oppress them. They were so confident in their own culture, in the power of their advanced technology, advanced ways of life, that obviously anyone who fell under their thumb would want to become like them. And so there was no need of oppressing. And they were right. That is exactly what happened. It's called Hellenization. I have a young woman in my bar mitzvah class. We're talking about Hellenization on Tuesday. Her name is Helen. She was very proud of it. She was like, wow, they named something after me. That's really great. And I had to tell her, no, it was not about that specifically. But there was great power, in going somewhere and simply imposing your culture. We wouldn't do that today, would we? I mean, we wouldn't go and open Starbucks in Japan or in China or McDonald's. We wouldn't do things like that. This is something that happened 2,000 years ago. And it worked. It really worked. We were already back then, we were the people of the book. We were people who were fascinated with ideas and exchanging ideas and discussing ideas. So when they came with their books and they came with their philosophers, and suddenly we were very much attracted to the whole thing. We changed our clothes. We started to wear the togas with the sandals. We changed our habits. We changed the way we lived. We changed the way our homes were. We started to name our children, and to this day it still happens, Alexander. Think about it. Here's a conquered people who after a generation or two begins to name their very children after the name of their conqueror. That's how powerful the aura of Greece was, of the empire was. So much so that we wanted to speak Greek. We wanted to be like them. And we started to actually forget Hebrew. Jews who followed the empire into Alexandria. There was a huge Jewish community in Alexandria, in Egypt, in Cairo after that, until really recently, until the 1950s. And that community started to really lose Hebrew. They all spoke Greek. It was the first time in Jewish history that we had to translate the Torah. The first translation ever of the Torah was in Greek. It's called the Septuagint. The myth goes that the rulers, the Greek rulers over Egypt, assembled 70 rabbis and asked each one to produce a copy, a translation of the Torah in Greek. And if they matched, they knew they had an original translation. And if they didn't, that was, you were risking your life. And the 70 rabbis came up with the exact same copy, the exact same translation from Hebrew into English. That's a nice story, but the story is pointing to the fact that we were, in just a few generations, losing who we were. We were losing our identity. We were losing our religion. We were really becoming one of the empire. And then, after 160 years of rule, there were the empire split in the southern empire and the northern empire, and we fell with the empire that was ruled actually out of Syria by a king named Antiochus. And Antiochus, after 160 years, thought, well, these Jews are not assimilating fast enough. We're going to have to raise the fire a little bit underneath their rear end and see what we can finish the transformation so that they may disappear and dissolve into the empire. And so he started to take more drastic measures. He, for example, took over the temple from the Jewish rule and put the great menorah and all the Jewish artifacts down in the basement and erected statues of pagan deities, statues of Zeus, other pagan deities all around the temple, and started to have pig sacrifices on the very Jewish altar of the high priest. And that started a revolt. Coupled with that, in order to really do away with the Jewish people, he decided that it was going to be forbidden under penalty of death to study the Torah anymore. It was going to be forbidden under penalty of death to circumcise your children, to observe Shabbat. And that was the straw that broke the Jewish camel's back. And a group of zealots, a group of Jews who thought that was too much, decided to take up arms. They belonged to the family called the Hashmoneans. And the Hashmoneans were a big clan, a big tribe, and they started to engage the armies of the Greek Empire in warfare in a way that was unique at the time. It was guerrilla warfare. They didn't have a name for it yet. But because they knew the terrain and they knew where and how to attack, they would have sporadic little attacks here and there. They would hammer at the troops of the Greek Empire and then disappear. They would ambush and hammer them here or there, and then they would disappear. Nobody would ever find them. They would merge into the population in the hills, in the forests. And that kind of attack where they would ambush, hammer, and retreat, that's how they came to be known. Because in that time, the name for hammering was Maccabee. And so they became the Maccabees, the hammerers, right? The guerrilla warriors. So this group, now named the Maccabees were going to fight the empire for 7 years. And eventually they are going to win. They're going to completely disrupt the empire and take over Jerusalem. In 164, they finally walk into Jerusalem. They take back the temple, tear down the statues, the pagan statues, clean everything they can clean. This is the 25th of Kislev, of the month of Kislev. 25th. It's interesting that it's the 25th when we know that this holiday is also in December. I'm just going to leave it at that. It's just something to think about. But it was the 25th of the month of Kislev, and they brought back from the basement all the Jewish artifacts of the temple, and especially the majestic seven golden branch menorah. The golden seven branch menorah. If I put the words in the right order, they'll be better. And then they thought to themselves, well, what do we do now? It's late in the winter. We need to celebrate something. We need to rededicate the temple to Jewish worship. So they looked around and they said to each other, what's the last major holiday we just missed? And they looked back in the calendar and said, well, the last major Jewish holiday that was just around the corner, a month and a half, 2 months ago, was the holiday of Sukkot. And they said, let's celebrate now, even 2 months later, in order to rededicate the temple, let's celebrate Sukkot. Sukkot is 8 days. And therefore, the holiday of rededication, and in Hebrew, rededication, in Hebrew it's Chanukkah. The holiday of dedication or rededication, the holiday of Chanukkah became mapped onto the 8 days of Sukkot, because that's what we celebrate on the 25th of Kislev in the year 164 BCE. I know there are children here, and I'm sorry about what I'm going to say. It's like learning that there was no Santa Claus. So if you don't want to know, plug your ears. There was never any miracle of lights and oil ever. Ever. It never happened. They made it up some hundreds of years ago after that. They made it all up. It's like, what are we going to do with this holiday? I'll tell you more about it in a few minutes. But sorry to drop this bomb on you on this holy, holy day. This is not, and I'm going to be very serious now, this is not the Jewish Christmas. It's very important to say that. Though it happens at the same time of the year, one has absolutely nothing to do with the other. This is about the celebration of war, of a military victory. It's the celebration of taking back your land from foreign invaders. It's the celebration of salvaging your own personal identity in the face of assimilation. It's about being true to who you are in the face of having external powers trying to mold you into something you're not. It's not, and has nothing to do with Christmas. I don't think they even have candles on Christmas, so I don't know. So that's also important to know and to say. When I grew up, we didn't get presents. It was not something we did. In Israel today, you could go, I don't know, maybe it's changed. I haven't been there for a while over Chanukkah, but nobody got presents. You lit the Chanukkah candles at home. You ate some very greasy, oily foods. I hope you had some of that tonight. And there'll be more when we go down for the oneg after this. And that's pretty much it. It's only when I came here and when I discovered the American customs that I discovered that we have to give gifts to our kids. My kids have no problem with that. But it's never, Hanukkah is I'll talk about that later. I'm getting ahead of myself.